You wake up at 2 a.m. The room is dark and quiet. You are not particularly stressed. Nothing alarming has happened. You simply opened your eyes in the middle of the night, and now you are lying there, awake in the hours when you're supposed to be sleeping, wondering what is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. In fact, what is happening to you at 2 a.m. might be one of the oldest and most natural things a human being can do. Because waking in the middle of the night, the very experience that modern sleep culture has pathologized, that has generated a billion-dollar sleep aid industry, that sends people to their doctors complaining of insomnia, is almost certainly not a modern disorder. It is an ancient behavior. And the story of why ancient humans woke in the middle of the night, what they did during those hours, and what that tells us about the nature of human sleep is one of the most quietly revolutionary findings in the science of human biology. Start with the assumption that most people carry about sleep. The assumption is that 8 hours of continuous, uninterrupted sleep is the natural human pattern, the biological baseline from which modern life has departed. This assumption is so pervasive that deviating from it in any direction is immediately interpreted as a problem. If you cannot fall asleep, you have insomnia. If you wake in the night, you have a sleep disorder. If you feel tired during the day, something is wrong with your sleep. The entire framework assumes that continuous, consolidated, 8-hour sleep is what nature intended. The evidence suggests this assumption is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Historian Roger Ekirch, in his landmark 2001 paper and subsequent book At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, spent 16 years combing through pre-industrial historical records, diaries, court documents, medical texts, literature from across Europe and beyond. What he found was a sleep pattern that virtually no one in the modern world practices or even knows about. Before the Industrial Revolution, the dominant human sleep pattern appears to have been not one continuous block, but 2 distinct sleep periods separated by an hour or more of wakefulness in the middle of the night. People called this first sleep and second sleep, and the period between them had a name, the watch or the watching hour. This pattern shows up everywhere in the historical record. Chaucer references it. Medieval medical texts prescribe specific activities for it. Court records mention crimes committed during it. Diaries describe what people did during it. Praying, reading, having sex, visiting neighbors, smoking, lying in contemplative thought. The watching hour was not insomnia. It was not a disorder. It was a recognized and unremarkable feature of ordinary human life. People expected to wake in the middle of the night. They had things they did during that time, and then they went back to sleep. The watching hour disappeared from the historical record within about a century of the widespread adoption of artificial light, gas lamps in the early 19th century, electric light shortly after. As the night became lit, people stayed up later, compressed the night, and eventually consolidated their sleep into the single block we now consider normal. The experience of waking between sleep periods, which had previously been completely unremarkable, became strange and alarming. And then it became a medical problem. Thomas Wehr, a psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health, essentially rediscovered this pattern in the 1990s through an experiment that has become one of the most cited findings in sleep research. Wehr took a group of participants and gave them 14 hours of darkness per night for a month, removing artificial light from their environments. Within a few weeks, virtually all of the participants shifted spontaneously into a biphasic sleep pattern, sleeping for 3 to 4 hours, waking for 1 to 3 hours, and then sleeping for another 3 to 4 hours. Without artificial light enforcing the consolidated pattern, the ancient pattern reasserted itself. The participants described the waking period as a state of unusual calm and relaxed alertness, not distressed wakefulness, not anxious tossing and turning, but something closer to the meditative, softly conscious state that lies at the boundary between sleep and full waking. So why did ancient humans wake in the middle of the night? The answers, when you lay them out, are multiple and mutually reinforcing. The first answer is predation and group vigilance. For most of human evolutionary history, sleeping was dangerous. The night was the time when predators were most active, when rival groups might attack, when fires could die and the cold could become lethal. A group in which everyone slept simultaneously through the night was a vulnerable group. The staggered waking pattern, in which different individuals within a group woke at different times during the night, would have functioned as a form of distributed sentinel behavior. Not a deliberate watch schedule, not a consciously organized guard duty, but an emergent pattern in which the natural variability in individual sleep architecture meant that at most times during the night, at least some members of the group were awake, alert, and capable of raising an alarm. Jerome Siegel's research on the Hadza, the San, and the Tsimane, hunter-gatherer groups in Africa and South America who still live without electricity and without the artificial light that disrupts the ancestral sleep pattern, found that members of these groups very rarely all sleep simultaneously. Even at the deepest part of the night, in any group of 20 or more individuals, at least one or two people are typically awake. The overlap between sleeping and waking members of the group is almost never zero. This is not insomnia. This is collective biological behavior that kept our ancestors alive through the night. The second answer involves temperature. The Hadza and other equatorial hunter-gatherers do not fall asleep at sunset when the air is still warm. They tend to fall asleep as the air cools, typically a few hours after dark, and wake naturally in the coldest hours before dawn, then rest again or engage in quiet activity before rising with the light. The sleep pattern of these groups is regulated less by light, as sleep researchers had long assumed, than by temperature. The cooling of the night air triggers sleep. The extreme cold before dawn stirs the group. This temperature sensitivity may explain not just the timing of sleep and waking in the ancestral environment, but also the pattern of waking in the middle of the night, the body responding to temperature cues that modern climate-controlled bedrooms have removed. The third answer is the nature of the brain state during the waking period. The period between first and second sleep is not neurologically neutral. It is characterized by an unusually high proportion of REM sleep in the preceding sleep period, and the transition to waking from REM produces a distinctive cognitive state, dreamy, associative, free from the analytic demands of full wakefulness, unusually permeable to imagery and emotion. People who have studied the watching hour in the historical record note that it was consistently described as a time of unusual vividness and inner richness, a time for prayer, for reflection, for sexual intimacy, for the processing of difficult emotions. Medieval writers sometimes described it as the best time for creative insight. Monks scheduled it as the optimal time for contemplative prayer. Psychologist Antonio Zadra and colleagues at the University of Montreal, who study the relationship between sleep, dreaming, and mental health, have found that the period of waking between sleep cycles is often associated with unusually vivid dream recall and what researchers call hypnagogic or hypnopompic imagery, the rich, semi-conscious imagery that occurs at the boundary between sleep and waking. This is not distress. It is a distinctive form of consciousness that the consolidated sleep pattern, by eliminating the waking period, may be suppressing entirely. The fourth answer is social. In the small groups in which humans evolved, nighttime waking was not a solitary experience in the way it is for most modern people. When someone woke in the watching hour, they were likely to find others awake, as well talking quietly, tending a fire, nursing an infant, working by firelight. The social and communal quality of the watching hour meant that it was not experienced as isolation or alarm, but as a recognized part of shared social life. The modern experience of waking in the night alone, in a dark room, in silence, surrounded by cues that everyone else is asleep and the world is closed, is radically different from the ancestral experience of waking into a dimly lit, socially inhabited nighttime world. This social dimension may be one of the most important factors in determining whether nighttime waking is experienced as distressing or as natural. Research on the psychological effects of nighttime waking consistently finds that the distress associated with waking in the night is caused not primarily by the waking itself, but by the interpretation of the waking by the belief that something is wrong, that this should not be happening, that the failure to sleep continuously is a medical problem requiring intervention. People who accept nighttime waking as normal, who lie quietly, allow the mind to wander, engage in calm activity, and trust that sleep will return, typically fall back to sleep naturally within an hour. The anxiety about the waking is more disruptive than the walking itself. What all of this suggests is that the epidemic of insomnia in the modern world, the millions of people who lie awake in the night, distressed by their wakefulness, reaching for sleep aids, and worrying about their sleep, may be partly an artifact of a cultural expectation that was created within the last 2 centuries and that does not correspond to the biological reality of human sleep. Insomnia, as currently understood and diagnosed, assumes that continuous consolidated sleep is the natural baseline. If the natural baseline is actually biphasic, if the ancient human sleep pattern involved regular nighttime waking as a normal and unremarkable feature, then millions of people may be suffering not from a disorder of sleep, but from a disorder of expectations about sleep. The next time you wake at 2 a.m., before you reach for your phone, before you begin calculating how many hours of sleep you have left, before the anxiety about your wakefulness compounds into the very problem you're trying to avoid, consider the possibility that what is happening to you is not a disorder. It is an inheritance. The ancient, natural, watching hour of your ancestors, preserved in your biology across thousands of years of consolidated sleep culture, asserting itself quietly in the